Hi everyone, Grover from Headphones.com here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Matrix X-Sabre Pro. So there's been a lot of buzz on the internet about this DAC, specifically because it uses an ESS 9038 Sabre chip implementation, ESS 9038 Pro specifically. And what's kind of interesting about this DAC is that it comes in at a fairly substantial price point for an ESS equipped DAC, even for one that has a premium chip. So basically the question is going to be, how good is this for a really high-end ESS Sabre chip DAC, specifically a 9038 Pro chip? I have to say the unit is very heavy. It's really, really nice, solid metal all throughout. There's almost no screws. The only screws are right here on the bottom. You can see along the edges. There are 3 feet, actually fairly nice rubberized points on them, nice metal feet, very hefty unit. It's quite heavy for how small it is. Along the front, we've got a little LED panel which tells you what setting you're on, as well as the sample rate and all that kind of stuff. Input and output selectors, switchable filters. There are a couple different switchable filters in here. Those are pretty easy to switch between. And you can also, this is actually quite handy, use a level control. So this can be a preamp, and you can also set it to level match another DAC that might have, say, a fixed output. So quite a handy thing to have. If you don't have a preamp and you're running powered monitors, for example, this could be quite handy. So the feature set is pretty solid. It's nothing like the RME ADI2 DAC at this price point. Doesn't have EQ and all that other cool stuff. Along the back, we've got our typical suite of inputs and outputs. We've got RCA and XLR outputs, and then the usual host of optical, AES, USB, and then there's also an I2S over HDMI input. Now, I don't know of too many devices that have that available yet, but it is popular with some people who are really into high-end digital, so it's kind of nice to have the option to connect that. USB can be either synchronous or asynchronous, and then you also have the, obviously, IEC power. Nothing crazy or revolutionary from a feature standpoint, but again, solidly built, all the inputs and outputs that you could possibly want from a DAC like this, and I really can't complain about any of that. One thing that I think is really interesting about really high-end DACs, especially DACs that I've heard in the pro audio realm, things like Weiss digital DACs, things like the Prism Sound DACs, not the consumer versions, but the really high-end mastering grade converters, and also the merging converters, is that they're almost boring when you first listen to them. They're so smooth in the upper mid-range, and they're so grainless, featureless, textureless, and they have this sense that there's just nothing annoying about the sound. It's all been sort of manicured out of any of the texture in the treble or mid-range. The bass varies a little bit between them, but not that much. Generally, it's, you know, solid, spot on, it's appropriate and level. But largely these DACs, like I said, they can almost sound underwhelming. They can almost be a little bit boring because they don't offer you anything extra. They're designed to play exactly what is on the recording and to be as grainless and as smooth and neutral as possible. To really be quite blunt, that's what the Matrix X-Sabre Pro aspires to do. Now, I know some people I've seen on the forums were a little bit disappointed, feeling that they wanted more sound or more stylized sound, or they wanted something that was a little bit more wow factor included in the first listen with the X-Sabre Pro. Now, I will say that that's not what you're gonna get. You're not gonna turn this DAC on and go, wow, it's amazing, it sounds so detailed, and it really has this great sense of space, and it's got, you know, all this texture to it. You're gonna turn it on and think, huh, is that what my digital really sounds like? You know, it's very straightforward sounding DAC. Things sound very balanced, they sound neutral, they sound clean. And really, the only thing that I immediately noticed on plugging it in with the default filter was that there was a little extra treble detail than I was used to from my R2R DACs or even my other high-end Delta Sigma DACs. Whether you have been a fan of Sabre chips in the past, or whether you like AKM chips or R2R or whatever, I will say that one thing that this DAC does really, really well is that it is totally absent of any of the harshness or glare or edge that some of the earlier Sabre DACs have had. This DAC is actually very listenable in the treble. It's got a ton of detail. It's really, really open sounding on the top end, but it's not annoying at all. I never, even on brighter headphones, even on HD800s or things like that, I was never getting a tonality that I felt was unpleasant in the way that old Sabre chips were. It wasn't, you know, quite as perfectly neutral as some of the most high-end DACs I've heard, but it was very, very clean, and it gave me even a little bit more detail than I'm used to at this price point in the treble. So very, very good in that regard. If you want super uber crystal clear treble, just on the edge of too much detail, but still listenable, then this is a great choice. Now, because the Matrix X-Sabre Pro has such finesse in the treble, there is a bit of a emphasis on the higher ranges. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this. This is not a treble emphasis. This is not, you know, that there's too much treble or that there's a tonal shift or any sort of tonal difference from neutral. What it is that the treble is so clean and has so much refinement that you notice it more, right? And so rather than it being a specific tonal bounce shift, I hear a slight sort of highlighting of the treble, if you will. It's just so detailed, my ear is sort of naturally drawn to it. Whereas a DAC like my Gunir Multibit, for example, really has a lot of meat on the low end and the low mids, and it tends to draw my ear down to the bass and the punch of the bass in a different way. The bass is great on this DAC. It has a good sense of texture, punch, clarity. The mid-range is clear and clean. It's not quite as seamless as the very best neutral DACs. It's definitely cleaner than I'm used to, even with DACs in the $1,200 price point. The RME ADI2 that I've had in recently, for example, super smooth, ultra listenable DAC. This DAC definitely had a little bit of a clarity edge over the RME, and that's something that I was surprised to hear. Usually with Delta Sigma DACs, you know, you feel like you hit the limits of what they can do from a resolution standpoint in the sub $1,000 price point. I didn't feel that was necessarily the case with this. However, I will say that because the SMSL SU9 exists and because the RME ADI2 DAC exists, it's a little bit more difficult a value proposition for this than it is for something like that. Again, the RME has such a huge range of features. It has all the EQ, it has all the routing functionality, it has a headphone amp built into it that's actually pretty solid. So for about almost twice the money, you're getting half of that functionality and half of the feature set. One thing that I liked about this though was the switchable filters. Switching it to the NOS filters, or actually one of the fast roll-off, sharper filters, did actually sound pretty good. When I was on the NOS filter, or one of the gentler filters, it rolled the treble off a little bit, and I can see some people preferring this sound being a little bit softer or a little bit more subdued in the treble because there is a slight emphasis just on the level of treble detail and refinement that's on offer in this DAC. As for if I would buy it, again, I think the form factor is awesome. It's very premium, it's very heavy, the casework is superb, it's great to use, it's got great functionality, and it feels really nice, and it does sound very, very good. If you can find these for reduced prices, or you buy one used, that it's definitely something I would look into if you really want that ultra crystal clear, very neutral sound with fantastic treble. I certainly wouldn't feel ripped off if I paid list price for this unit. It's just that in comparison to what's available on the market now, there are Sabre chip implementations that are really fantastic, and unfortunately, due to AKM's factory fire, we're going to be seeing a lot more Sabre chip ESS implementations that are really, really good. I also think that in general, a DAC that leans a little bit towards the high end is something that I just am not looking for that often, mostly because in the personal audio realm, I find it to be a little bit unpleasant to have too much treble. I actually don't want too much treble detail with my headphones, but that's a personal preference. So if you have a preference for having tons of treble detail and tons of openness in the high end with your headphones, then this might actually be a great choice if you wanted to build something that really had a great degree of clarity. I will also say that if you wanted to use this DAC with something like a pretty colored tube amplifier on a high impedance set of headphones, and you had a pretty warm setup going, this might actually complement it really well. When I was using some of the Sennheiser or ZMF headphones, such as the ZMF Verite with the Forge, using some of the more colored tube options off of some of the higher impedance taps on that amp, this was a great DAC partner to that because it highlighted the treble range in a way that I found pleasing in combination with that. In my mind, if you're just looking for clean and clear, you can get it for a little bit less, unless you're a really fussy audiophile. If I was working in my studio doing mixing or doing some sort of professional work, or I wanted really linear digital for whatever reason, this is definitely a great choice. And that studio environment is where that last little bit of refinement is going to show up and be meaningful. Something that might be in a similar price point is if you can find a used or on sale Dangerous Music Dangerous Convert 2. That's a DAC that's going to be very competitive in terms of feature set and sound with the Matrix. Probably going to have a little bit more wow factor because the voltage output is a bit higher, and also because the Dangerous Convert 2 to me does sound a little bit wider than reality. But overall, you know, I think the studio space is where the little bit of extra refinement on the Matrix X-Sabre Pro is going to shine.